Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining the Smart Content Framework today. We are ready to start already. And today, as you can see, we'll be talking about how to integrate goals, audiences, and data into a smarter strategy. And let's check if this is something that you are doing already. And if you have any doubts, as you have seen in the comments, please let them in the chat and we'll go through them later in the webinar, okay? So first of all, allow me to present myself. I'm Joel. I'm a digital strategist and content marketing specialist here in Good Rebels. But we are not here to talk about myself today too much. Instead, let's talk about the future of brands and of content. And if you know Good Rebels, if you know anything about us, you will probably recall that we have been talking a lot about human-centered organizations. And this is a belief we have that brands and companies and organizations won't be relevant anymore unless they start integrating not only consumers, but also coworkers, also citizens, and many other stakeholders around that are really relevant for their strategy, storytelling, and of course, in order to gain their trust, because we are in a trust crisis when it comes to content anymore. So, most of the people, when you ask them, if I was asking what content is really about, they would probably answer that it's all about achieving goals, right? And this is probably something that you feel as well, that if you are a content creator, or if you are, I don't know, managing a team that is generating content, or if you are developing a content strategy within your company, you will be quite confident that it's generating goals altogether. But more often than not, eventually, even if that was the initial idea, and I like to say that at that point, content was at the service of the brand, but more often than not, it turns out to be the other way around. So it's the brand being at the service of the content. So this is what actually happens, and this is probably something that you are experiencing now, that you're generating content to filling in the gaps. And this is a bad situation to be in, because content is expensive. Content definitely has a cost in human resources or on production costs. So of course, if you're generating content, you need to it has to be accountable, and you need to make sure that it's impacting your goals, whatever they are. Okay, so today we'll be talking about a framework we've been using in Good Rebels for many of our clients. And of course, it depends a lot on how your organization is. And of course, it depends a lot on your brand. But mostly there are 6 main pillars, 6 main steps that you can follow, and you will be certain that you have a solid framework, you have a solid strategy when it comes to content, and of course, to see if you're generating profitable content, okay? So on how to generate a great content strategy is all about 6 things, as we said. The first one is, of course, defining your goals. This is the most vital point, as you will soon realize. Then we'll talk also about on how to identify your audience. So there are a lot of ways to do that, but it's very important that you can know what your key audience are. And then you will, of course, need to define your brand ethos, so your personality, and of course, the messages and the storytelling that there's behind it. And then, of course, the social galaxy. So, the platforms, the formats, or even the final ideas that you will be using in all of your platforms in order to communicate. Then, of course, we'll talk about a measurement plan, because otherwise you won't be sure on your strategy working at all regarding your goals. And then finally, you will have to think on your media plan, because nowadays, and we can discuss about that later, not having a media plan, and when I say media plan, you can understand digital media plan, but mostly social media plan, social paid media plan, is that you will be irrelevant unless you can integrate all of your production, all of your content efforts into paid media efforts. So let's get started. So first of all, when it comes to strategic goals, there's usually kind of a misconception on what a strategic goal is. So for instance, if I asked all of you now, probably you would have a good guess on connecting strategic goals to commercial goals, or goals that eventually drive to sales, even, I mean, in either step of the funnel, but that's kind of only one part of the big picture, because as we said in the introduction, companies nowadays are not only made or perceived by what they do commercially. So there's a whole different area which we would need to integrate, which is, of course, our communication or corporate goals or dimension. So when we see things like the perception of the brand or the employee perception, so this is something that really builds your brand and builds the perception on your key audiences. So you will see that some of your audiences will care more or will care less about this, but eventually you will be seen only as one brand. So there's not really a point on building different brands, even if you're working on different platforms, because maybe your brand has more than one platform. Maybe you are, I don't know, working on a corporate Facebook page, and then instead you have also a marketing Facebook page. So sometimes that can make sense when you have different teams working on it, but from the audience perspective, that's not a line they can draw. So the boundaries are really difficult to tell. So eventually they will see you only as one brand. So the point here is that no matter what you talk about, it will mean a lot to the final, customer, citizen, or coworker. So everything builds. So from now on, when you talk about strategic goals, try to think on everything that builds your company and your brand. Don't think only on the marketing side. So, for instance, if we see this matrix now, you will see that you can work on different business goals, communication goals. Some of them might have more control. Some of them will be focused more on activating specific audiences. But you see, the red ones are more connected to corporate goals, usually, or corporate assets. The ones on the left are more connected to marketing. Okay, so for instance, your brand concept or your business expertise. So those are assets that will, of course, build on your storytelling, on your content, and they can help you mostly, generate business. And of course, when I talk about control, I mean keeping your key customers or your key audiences. And then, of course, the product and the service will be your main asset to activate towards sales, or whatever your goal is. But then communication also works on generating more loyal audiences when it comes to understanding what you are talking about, or when you need to show some credentials. So for instance, your corporate tradition or your positioning as a brand, or even your employer brand, which maybe you are working separately right now, it tells a lot about what you will need to communicate even on other sides. So to sum it up, you will see that some of those assets can really help you engage or consider your product. I mean, make your audiences consider more your brand or your products. And then, of course, some others will be more relevant when impacting or driving to sales. So the second step is all about identifying your audiences. And you will see that mostly people talk about customers here when they talk about audiences. And now we want to include also citizens and coworkers. And when I talk about citizens, you will see that it really depends on your company, but you need to realize that everyone, absolutely everyone, is a potential audience for your content. So everyone will have an opinion on what you do. And you might think that you don't care a lot, but some of those citizens, as we call them, can really be important channels of diffusion when it comes to your content, or they might be sharing your stories at some point. So we're talking about experts. We're talking about maybe media experts at some point even, or maybe people that really want to talk about your brand as a case study or as an important brand altogether, even if they are not consuming your product. And this is an important audience we need to keep in mind at some point. And then, of course, your coworkers, because impacting your coworkers is something that gives you really, I mean, it really gives you two things as an asset. The first one is that if you learn to communicate to them, I mean, even if you do it outwards, you will see that it's quite positive to impact your coworkers, because eventually, and this is the reason number two, they will be talking much more about you if they are well informed. So, this webinar will not be about coworker advocacy, but one of the reasons coworker advocacy can be built upon is because you have a solid content strategy that considers your coworkers too. So when you are considering your audiences, you also need to think on which part of your storytelling, which part of your communication will be more relevant to them. Because once you have decided on your goals, you will see that some of your audiences will be more, they will be more eager to learn or to listen to specific parts of the story. And you will need to learn also on how to manage the best tone and style, and of course your personality towards them. So we have this method which goes from the who to the why. So deciding on the who is very easy because, of course, once you set on the goals, you should decide who your audiences will have to be impacted for that goal to happen. So, for instance, if I want to talk about my employer brand, I want to communicate to coworkers, but also to some part of the citizens. But if I want to drive sales, of course, I will need to impact very specific part of my customers. So when we talk about audiences, the best idea is to ask you a lot of questions on why do they like about your brand, which stories would they like to hear from you. And as that happens, you can probably start drafting your audiences into different target personas, or the most common name should be buyer persona, but at this point it's not only about people that will buy to you. So target personas should be part of your strategy. So in order to personalize your content towards your different target personas, you should follow basically two rules. The first one is don't use too many target personas. So maybe decide on 5-6 key target personas all around your areas, all around your business or communication goals, okay? And then the second rule is that you should try to decide on content that will be, when personalizing, significantly different to them. Because if there is not a big difference when personalizing that content, it doesn't make much sense to have too many audiences to impact, okay? So there's an important step here that is defining your brand ethos. So of course, defining your goals, defining your audiences is important. And let me tell you that in this webinar, of course, we won't go deeply into those topics, but you should take into account that in order to decide your goals, you should keep in mind, of course, your whole business strategy. So this is not a social media strategy or digital strategy only even. You should focus on your real goals that you will account for. So, whatever you achieve here should be translated and compared to your other channels of impact. And then when deciding your audiences, this is not something you can really make up, of course. So maybe you have heard of different techniques. Maybe on our last webinars when we were talking about research. So maybe you will need social research or digital research, or maybe using some panels or focus groups, but or leveraging your CRM right now. But it's really important that your audiences, your target personas, are built on solid data, so that they can really define who you will be impacting. So going back to the brand ethos, this is more about branding when it comes to the personality of what you are, communication-wise, content-wise. So you should decide, of course, it needs to be consistent with what people think you are, with what kind of company and brand you are. But you should decide on what your brand ethos is when it comes to social as well, because sometimes a lot of brands are very solid outside of the digital world, but they will still need to communicate with different rules when it comes to social media, for instance. So when you have your brand ethos, so a brand ethos is all about keeping it simple. So maybe you have 3 different words, 3 different keywords that define how your brand behaves. So for instance, I could say a brand is open, passionate, and smart. And that really needs to translate into specific actions and into specific ways to tell stories that no other brand could replicate. So it needs to be something unique, something that they will, of course, recognize you in the future. And it should allow you to have a list of do's and don'ts, even eventually, because there will be some actions, some ideas, some ways to tell stories that you will be like, this doesn't really follow the brand ethos of my brand. So I'm not doing that, even if I think it can give me results. Or maybe when you want to be linked to other brands or other communities, this is something you need to ask yourself. So would my brand do this? And the other way around, of course. So, when you decide your brand ethos, since, of course, this has to be a roadmap, okay? So you decide and you set your goals, you set your audiences, and of course, once you have your personality, now we can finally start talking about how can you tell stories. So you will need to define how you can communicate, as we have discussed already. And then, of course, you will need to learn how the different audiences and how that connects to each goal. So it's really something you need to put together, that each target persona, so each archetype of your target personas will want to be communicated in a different way. And of course, when we were talking about audiences, it might make sense for you. So if you are working in an industry that really has a lot of differences between different types of audience, it might make sense to separate that world and go deeply into sub-archetypes. So for instance, if you are into the, automotive industry, it might make sense for you to develop different types of drivers, and those could be your target personas. But eventually it's all about getting the right message. So the right story for the right persona, or the right tone for the target persona. So now we are starting to talk about a consistent content strategy that is led, of course, by your initial goals. Then the 4th step is all about deciding where that communication will happen. So a lot at this point. You should know a lot about your audiences, and you should probably be able to infer where they are consuming content in general. So now let me be clear on this, because it could be that some of your target personas are not even in social media, and this is something that you will need to realize at some point. Or it could be that some of your audiences are in some platforms, but there aren't too many in others. Or it could be that even if they are consuming all of the social platforms, some of them don't really want to use those platforms the same way. They don't want to be communicated the same way. So for instance, someone doesn't want to be reached the same way on LinkedIn that than on Instagram, you know. But looking at this galaxy, which is, you know, for media strategy standards, it's, you know, the obvious thing, like from owned content to earned content, or owned area to earned area. So there are different layers here, but, you know, you could have your whole strategy represented in something like this. So coming from your main social media channels, maybe integrating your content sites, but you could also have or leverage brand communities, or maybe we can talk about promoted content which will reach other audiences more than organic. Of course, paid media, if you're developing paid media more than, I mean, outside of social paid media. But you could leverage people as well, because as we said, coworkers or ambassadors you can develop can really be not only good assets, but good communication channels for your brand. So, you know, you could train or develop eventually or acquire digital spokespeople inside your company that are very active on digital. You could activate digital coworkers that can be your coworker advocates, or you could have maybe fans or brand ambassadors at some point, okay? And then eventually we can talk also about user-generated content, which is also part of your strategy, if you think of it. Even if you think you can't really control user-generated content, I'm pretty sure you can think of different, you know, actions, campaigns, techniques you can develop to acquire that content that is already happening on social media, or of course, media talking about you. Okay, so this should be your digital galaxy, and all of your goals that you want to communicate, they should be achievable, even if it's not only by owned content or owned channels. Maybe some of your ambassadors, maybe some of your coworkers are achieving those goals instead. Okay, but then to be more specific, of course, when you decide on the platforms you want to be, because you know your key audiences will be on those channels, and of course, maybe in order to know that, you will have to do some research on digital behavior and digital use. This is something we commonly do for most of our clients. And once you know exactly where your audience is, you need to think on your messages, because sometimes they depend. I mean, you need to rethink on your messages because they depend on the platforms, and they depend on the formats, and they depend on the creative ideas you're developing to tell those stories. So it's really important that everything fits together. So just to put an example, that you might have a specific goal aimed to a specific audience, then you realize that specific audience is, of course, seeing you in a specific platform, and then that specific platform has specific formats that can be leveraged. So some of your messages can be more creative depending on the format, but then eventually you will need to track if you are achieving that goal. So talking about measurement plan, which is step 5, you need to ask you questions like, who is really my target audience, which you should know already, which key messages and creative formats will help better motivate my audiences, and most importantly now, which metrics will help us understand how effectively we have met our objective. So for instance, I could have, a quite simple strategy, but I want to reach, I want to engage, and of course I want to activate. And then I could have specific goals linked to that strategy. So, like granularly, you could go to more specific goals, like increasing general awareness is one thing, but reaching new territories is another thing. So this is all about penetration, for instance. And then when it comes to engaging and co-creation is one thing. So maybe I want fans to really, engage and give me insights, but increasing the people talking about me or commenting on the brand is a different thing. The same with, driving traffic or earning new assets, new advocates, right? So in order to understand which are the metrics that will best help us, decide on our success, we need to be very specific on which behavior we expect to trigger on those audiences towards those specific goals. So for instance, if my strategy here is that I want to reach, so this is something I really want from my strategy, and I have decided I have 2 specific goals there. Those should be accountable for with specific metrics that really measure that behavior. So, and that only, not any other behavior, that only. So, for instance, video views, specific reach on social, brand recall. This is something that helps me understand that I have reached a specific critical mass. When it comes to engage, so for instance, I would be more focused on paying attention to likes, shares, comments, CTR, so click-through rate or engagement rate or video view rate, because this really tells me that people was interacting with me at some point. But I don't care that much on if this content is reaching other audiences, because I should be expecting only one behavior here. So the same happens when I want to convert or generating leads. So I should be focused on, I don't know, getting traffic, getting link clicks or conversions, but I shouldn't care too much about getting likes. I mean, I can have them in my reports, but I should either give them very low value when it comes to deciding if they have been successful in my strategy, or ignore them at all. So the final step here is all about the media plan. As we said previously, not having a media plan makes your content strategy probably irrelevant eventually. And when we talk about social media plan, it's not a lot of media investment we're talking about, but of course, if your strategy depends only on the organic reach, this is not something that will be, in the long run, you're wasting your money, because you're producing content that won't reach enough people for it to be relevant. So, some of the key learnings here are that organic reach is almost dead. So please don't depend on it. Then the concept of community is almost dead too, because since the organic reach is so low on social media platforms, this means that most people won't keep track of your storytelling, of your stories. So it's not a good idea to think that you have a community following all your content anymore. Then that you should focus on macro content. So if you have spent more resources on high level production, or if you're generating innovation content or content that goes beyond your creative standards, you should also put paid media efforts on it, because otherwise you're not generating enough value. Okay, and then finally, keep in mind that the media plan will help you reach other audiences that wouldn't be reachable if you depend only on organic. So, the good thing is that since you know your goals and you know your audiences and you know the brand ethos and you know the platforms and you know the formats, developing a connected media plan here should be quite easy when it comes to that. So we are getting to the end of the webinar. To sum it all up, I just want to welcome you to the Smart Social Framework, and this is how it all should look. So only, one slide only, you should be able to understand what your strategy is. So just as a recap, coming from your strategic goals, which you should define not only from a marketing perspective, but also a communication perspective. So this is not only about media goals. This is not only about generating awareness or getting leads or converting. This is about expecting specific behaviors, so specific goals connected to that. So you can end up with different strategic goals. So in this example, you can see 7 different strategic goals. So then the next step is link them to your key audiences, to your target personas, decide on who they are, and then work on different blocks. So you can have clients, citizens, and coworkers maybe, and then decide on the sub-archetypes. So for instance, depending on your industry, you could have different kinds of drivers or different kinds of, people living at their homes. So if you're working on home furnishing, for instance. And then you will need to decide on the platform. So where will you be communicating? Because you have understood already where those target personas can be found. And then you will need to decide on specific topics that can talk about your goals to those specific audiences, and that they will accept, considering how those audiences want to be communicated. So you will also decide on your brand ethos, or you will try to connect it with specific tones connected to topics and connected to personas, of course. And then finally, we can start talking about our content plan, which is all about format definition, key messages and assets you can include, and then even maybe a final concept definition. And of course, final step, media plan and performance analysis. So this is all about the webinar today. I don't know if you have any questions. I will read through your comments now. Okay, I can see one question here. So what processes do you go through when defining personas? Okay, that's a very good question. And I'm sorry that today we couldn't go deeply into each step. Maybe in the future we can do. But to answer to your question, of course, it's all about the data you have first. So probably if you have, your CRM is a good way to start generating different segments so that you can start understanding which clients are buying more or which ones don't do too much. So this is a good way to define different target personas. But then you can also connect that to the specific behavior they have towards your brand or your company. So as I said, it's not only a matter of if they buy you a lot or not, but how they live usually, how they expect to connect to your brand. I mean, how do they talk about you? You can also segment them by age groups. You can also segment them by, of course, other brands they like, or other things they do, hobbies they have. So eventually you develop kind of a archetype. So an archetype is based on your data that you have. Of course, if you don't have enough data, my recommendation would be to develop some panels, develop some research on your clients, ask them. Maybe you have to do some surveying to understand them. So eventually you will have enough information to divide into groups. So those groups need to be strategic for you. So for instance, you could have one target persona, which is my best client. Okay, and that target persona has a specific behavior and way of life, okay, with the data you have gathered. Then you have another one, which is maybe your second best customer. But then there are probably differences in social demographics, actually. And then you could have another one, maybe that is not a customer, but it's a coworker. So this is also a target persona, because you need to decide on how most of your coworkers are. And you could have maybe 2 target personas for your coworkers if you're very interested in that. But it's not a good idea to develop too many target personas, and now you will see why. And then eventually you could have another target persona, which is those audiences that you would like to reach, but they are not converting, or they are not generating whatever you want to achieve with your brand. So this is another target persona, and they will have another way of life. And you will need to understand, because the way they behave, the way they connect to your brand or your company will really help you a lot to develop specific messages and personalized messages to them, because they don't expect the same, okay? Now, my advice would be to not have more than 6 or 7 target personas. Probably the ideal would be 5, actually, because if you're working on a content strategy, and I really mind where you do it, because it could be social, it could be marketing automation, it could be anywhere, it could be in your website, it could be newslettering, but the important thing about target personas is that, I mean, they are only valuable if you can personalize content for them. So if the differences between them are not very, very high, so if you have, let's say, 20 target personas, chances are that some of them will be quite similar. So eventually you won't be able to personalize content, at least not in a profitable way, because you won't see results when personalizing. And of course, this is something that requires a lot of time, defining personas. This is a process. You will need to develop. Maybe you will need some months. Maybe you will need to go through a lot of data, but eventually this is something that you can optimize in the future. So it doesn't mean that if you don't have the data today to develop target personas, you don't have to try to develop them. it just means that maybe they won't be as solid as they will be in the future when you keep feeding them, okay? So anyway, if you have more specific doubts, remember that you can still go through the Rebel Thinking article we prepared about this topic specifically. And I hope there you will have more detail and more examples on how this process can be held. So there's another question now. It's, do you recommend any tool to develop the buyer persona profile? Okay, so when it comes to research tools, there are different panels you can work with. So one we have used a lot here, for instance, is Global Web Index, which is a very interesting panel with data from all over the world. And you can build different segments with different keywords, different interests, and eventually those panels, which actually are surveys that are being held once every quarter. So they will give you back all the information about those specific audiences that you had in mind, if they consume your brand or not, if they talk about, I don't know, cars or not, if they are between 18 years old or 25 years old, where they live. So if you work with panels like that, and the tricky part here is that you need to learn to make the right questions. But if you make the right questions, the right queries, you will eventually get some data here and there. But probably just the panel is not enough. So my recommendation should be leverage your CRM. So for instance, if you have your client databases, try to analyze some of them with your, I don't know, intelligence area, which can help a lot. And if you don't really have access to that, another thing you can do is try to develop surveys for your clients. So if you have in mind different age groups, for instance, you can start asking specific questions through, I don't know, Typeform plus and similar tools, which you can use, and you can start surveying. And then finally, you can also leverage some focus groups or workshops you can do with some of your clients, some of your coworkers, some of the key audiences or stakeholders you think might be interested on your communication strategy at some point, and ask them what they think, what they feel about it. So I don't know if I answered to your question. Probably you were expecting more specific tools, but if that is so, I remember we had a webinar 2 months ago, which was all about research techniques. And I'm guessing we also have a Rebel Thinking article about that. So probably we can link to the article at some point. Oh, and also you can find those webinars on YouTube if you want. So the problem with these kind of questions is that they really depend a lot on your scope of work and on your internal structure when it comes to that. So my advice here should be to also understand what your budget is and how low profile or high profile you want to make your content strategy when it comes to that. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. Of course, if you have any more questions in the future, you know where to find me. And please make sure to review also previous webinars or Rebel Thinking articles if you think you want to learn more from specific topics we might not have covered today. And then, of course, thank you for your feedback too. And let's hope we can develop some more webinars about the topics you're most interested in. So thank you and see you next time.